Yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. As Lynn says, this is a very important online workshop for us to get plenty of opinion and advice on policy around permanent grasslands. So we're just going to give a quick overview of some of the outputs and a bit of background around permanent grasslands, some of the results of the integrated systematic review we did in the natural science part of the project, and then some perspectives from farmers and citizens. So just to give you a very quick background about the project, as Lynn says, it's all about permanent grasslands. And within this project, what do we mean by that? Well, essentially, it's any land with herbaceous or grass cover that's not been part of an arbor rotation for 5 years or more. So that's the sort of European Commission definition that we're using right across the project. Just in terms of the aim, so what we're aiming to do, what we've been aiming to do for the past 4 or 5 years, is to sort of co-develop sustainable permanent grassland systems and policies, and that's the key part today, that will be effective in optimizing productivity, so producing biomass, meat, milk, dairy products, but also while supporting biodiversity and delivering a number of other public goods and services, or ecosystem services, if you want to call them that. And I'll say more about those specific ecosystem services in a minute. You can read the methodology, but essentially we've had 14 countries involved across Europe. And in terms of outcomes and impact, we're looking to sort of better understand the importance and functioning of permanent grasslands through the farm networks and experimental platforms, looking to increase the availability and uptake of permanent grassland management options and technologies. Overall improve the competitiveness of farming systems based on permanent grassland. And then the focus of today's workshop is sort of helping out with developing agricultural policies that support the optimal management of permanent grassland, but we can sort of discuss what we mean by that through the course of this morning. So next slide just gives us the specifics in terms of the ecosystem services or public goods that we've focused on within the Super G project. So if I'm just going to go clockwise, same slide, please. Clockwise from top left. What we've looked at is biodiversity and pollination service. And then we looked at storage or sequestration of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, then water quality. And then we've also looked at production of biomass and a bit of a focus on production of meat and milk dairy products, because other projects have looked at other aspects of biomass production and biorefineries. Then we've also looked at landscape aesthetics and cultural values. That's the one at the bottom. And then finally looking at the service that permanent grassland provides in terms of reducing flooding risk and protecting soils from erosion. So that's been the focus of the project in terms of what permanent grasslands can provide. Next slide. So if we've heard about what the potential for permanent grasslands is, but we also realize that permanent grasslands are under a number of different threats, both in terms of their very existence, but also in terms of their ability to provide this range of ecosystem services, or what we term as multifunctionality. And we did some work early in the project looking at what sort of areas we think are under threat from the various specific threats, which is what this chart represents. So we looked at threat from abandonment in relation to climate change, threats from heat or drought stress, conversion from permanent grassland to temporary grassland, conversion from permanent grassland to arable land, threats from nitrogen deposition, and then threats from the intensification of production, and then also conversion to forest. And more recently, we've also realized that over-extensification may also be a risk or a threat to multifunctionality. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background in terms of the permanent grassland area in the UK, in terms of what the sort of current situation is and the trends have been over the last few years. Yes, Priscilla, I think you can ask questions there. We'll try and deal with questions as we go along. If we've got time, hopefully we will. So in terms of the general trends, if we look at the sort of sort of pure permanent grass and the grass that's been in grass for over 5 years or more, There's been a general increase over the last few years, increase of 18%, although sole right rough grazing has reduced quite significantly. Temporary grassland's gone down, again, quite significantly. If we look at total permanent grassland overall, so that's the grass over 5 years and the sole right rough grazing combined, a slight reduction. And then if we look at grassland in total, yes, a slight reduction of 8%. So there appear to be some issues that the reductions aren't as drastic as they have been in other parts of Europe, but there does seem to be an issue in terms of maintaining levels or areas of permanent grassland. Next slide, please. So in terms of aerial extent, you see on the right-hand side where most of the permanent grassland is concentrated in the United Kingdom. And we know from recent work that improved and semi-natural grasslands cover about 40% of the UK. So about 30% covered by improved grasslands, 10% by semi-natural grasslands. So that's the sort of general picture. But in terms of the sort of nature and condition of those permanent grasslands, we also know that there's been quite a large reduction in sort of species-rich grasslands. So between the 1930s and the 1980s, we've lost around 97% of lowland wildflower meadows, for example. And we know that around, or certainly less than 1% of UK land area is now species-rich grassland. So there is potential to increase that area. And there has been a general trend towards intensification in recent decades for reasons which are clear to us since the Second World War. Next slide, please. So now, very quickly, I'm just going to give a very quick overview of current policies for PG protection, or current trends for permanent grassland protection and management. In terms of protection, we've got the environmental impact assessment, agriculture regulations, which I'll go into in a minute. But in general, since Brexit or EU exit, there's been a policy focus shift away from sort of direct payments towards general greening and net zero. So it's less about direct payments, more about public money for public goods. But there's been differing rates of policy change, policy evolution in the different nations. So basic payments being phased out in England and probably in Wales as well, but retained in Scotland and Northern Ireland to some degree, as far as we understand it at the moment. So just to focus on England for the moment, what we have is the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which operates across 3 tiers. So we have the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which has sort of evolved through sort of co-design process with farmers, and the Sustainable Farming Incentive 2023 recently launched, which gives us a menu of actions. And on the right there, you see some of the actions that are available for farmers to adopt. So far, that's been done on the basis mainly on income forgone rather than the value of ecosystem services delivered, but that's has been discussed sort of widely, and maybe something for debate today. On the second tier, we've got Countryside Stewardship and Countryside Stewardship Plus, which will be integrated with the SFI 2023. And then the highest tier, we've got Landscape Recovery, which requires cooperation between land managers and farmers at the sort of catchment or sort of peatland restoration scale. So all of these things are looking to sort of pay farmers for sort of protecting or enhancing the environment and delivering a range of public goods. Next slide, I'll just quickly give an outline of the environmental impact assessment agriculture regulation. So this is the key regulation that actually protects permanent grasslands as we would understand them. So this applies to England specifically, although there are similar regulations in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So under these regulations, you must not begin or carry out a project on uncultivated land or semi-natural area without first obtaining a screening decision or consent from Natural England. And what we mean by uncultivated land is land that has not been cultivated in the last 15 years. So it's a longer period than the European Commission sort of 5-year definition. So it's anything that's not been cultivated by physical or chemical means. So in terms of physical, we mean ploughing or an activity that breaks the soil surface, or disrupts the subsoil. Chemical, we mean by adding fertilizer or soil improvers. And it also applies to semi-natural areas, including priority habitats. And many of those priority habitats, or a list of priority habitats, includes semi-natural grasslands. It also applies to heritage, archaeological features, and protected landscapes. Next slide, please. So finally from me, just wanted to give you some outputs from the project, which resulted from the integrated systematic review we did, looking at how permanent grasslands deliver across a range of ecosystem services, which you see along the bottom there, how permanent grassland does it in comparison to cropland and temporary grassland and forestry. So that's a sort of land use comparison. And then also within permanent grassland itself, how do different management contrasts affect the delivery of ecosystem services? And the systematic review looked at thousands and thousands of papers and we found 696 papers that were relevant and found the following results. So next slide, please. So we first of all, just concentrating in this slide with the donut on the right, the contrast between permanent grassland and cropland. You'll see that the blue circles represent that contrast between permanent grassland and cropland. If the blue circles are in the green part of the donut, that means the result is favorable for permanent grassland for each of the indicators. If the blue dot is in the inner sort of orange zone, it means it's unfavorable. That indicator, or that permanent grassland is unfavorable for the indicator in comparison to cropland. So for cropland, you'll see that, or for permanent grassland compared to cropland, you'll see that permanent grassland are as good or better at delivering most ecosystem services. The notable exceptions being yield and energy. And then if we look at the orange dots, which looks at the comparison between permanent grassland and temporary grassland, we'll see that compared to temporary grasslands, PG are as good or better at delivering all the ecosystem services that were studied. So that's the land use contrast. If we look at the next slide, we'll see the results from the systematic review from the management comparisons. So again, on the donut on the right, the blue dots are representing grassland renewal, the green increased defoliation, and the red nitrogen input. And again, if the dots are towards the outside, the green phase, that means it's favorable, or the management intervention is having a favorable effect on the indicator. So it's good news. If we're in the inner part of the donut, the orange bit, then it's bad news in terms of the effect of that management intervention. So in conclusion, then, the blue circles, the grassland renewal, we found that that increases yield, energy, and protein, but can impact on water quality and lead to loss of carbon and higher greenhouse gas emissions. Increased defoliation, being the green dots, that increased protein and energy in the grass, but decreases yield and can have negative effects on pollinators, threatened species, and botanical diversity. And then finally, nitrogen input, the red dots. Nitrogen had clear benefits for yield and protein in the grass, but impacts pollinators, threatened species, botanical diversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and water quality. So we can see clearly here that there are sort of trade-offs between sort of production and the delivery of other ecosystem services and multifunctionality. So our general conclusions on the next slide. We concluded from the study and other work we've done is that preventing the conversion of permanent grassland to cropland or temporary grassland secures the provision of multiple ecosystem services. Intensification within permanent grassland management seems to threaten multifunctionality, in other words, delivering multiple public goods. But by prioritizing these non-feed or non-provisioning ecosystem services, that can come at a cost for the provision of animal feed. So we're really looking to sort of try and protect permanent grassland, but also optimize the management intensity to increase multifunctionality. And with that, I'll pass on to Lynn for citizen farmer perspectives.
Okay, there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to answer that, Paul.
Okay, yeah. Um,
It's just, hi Paul, just
yeah,
one,
9%.
one from me. Really, I mean, I guess it's obvious that those permanent grasslands deliver less yield, but also potentially better water quality than our temporary grasslands. But is that just logical due to the fact that they receive less fertilizer? I mean, I guess the way to look at it slightly differently is if we were to apply the same amounts of fertilizer to our temporary grasslands, would we just see a similar effect there as well? You know,
Yeah, interesting one.
is it
We'd
more to
have to
do with
look.
the fact
Yeah,
that they are permanent or temporary as opposed to the fact that they are receiving less inputs?
yeah, we'd have to look at the specifics of those studies. But yeah, I get your point that the permanent grasslands will generally get less fertilizer. So I suppose under less pressure in terms of delivering the sort of water quality service. But yeah, no, thanks for that.
Okay, citizens' concerns and priorities. So this is the result of combined qualitative focus group work and a big survey across 5 different European countries. I've tried to pull out some of the UK perspectives, but I just want to point out that citizens are not a homogenous group. Some citizens have preference for provisioning, seeing the environment as a place where we grow food, and others have preferences, for example, for the more aesthetic qualities of the landscape. So this is a very broad brush. Our overall conclusions: citizens did perceive grassland landscapes in a very positive way. This is in terms of linking it to their past experience, a kind of emotional positivity, environmental characteristics, the beauty of the landscape, but also in terms of access and the kind of cultural identity that they have, how they associate with the countryside within their country. Perceptions of problems were related to reduction in these permanent grasslands, degradation, and abandonment. Although I will say that some of our citizens were also in favour of rewilding. So it's not a cut and dry argument. There was appreciation of farming for biodiversity, a lot of evidence that trust in policymakers and land managers predicted the acceptability of current practices and I guess also emerging policies. There was a difference between prioritization of food production and biodiversity in terms of how the public visualized permanent grassland within the landscape, and a debate about land sharing versus land sparing. So should we spare some land and rewild and intensify to ensure food security? Or should we take a more general approach to ensuring permanent grasslands delivers both food and biodiversity? And the big question, of course, is that policy is not going to be successful if the public think it's unacceptable. So how does policy reconcile these different perspectives? Next one, please. So different people want different things. Some examples: some people prefer a tidy landscape, and I'd say this is pretty much in contrast to landscape restoration, particularly contingent on how far back we go in restoring those landscapes. If you go back in the UK, more than 500 years, it would look very different in terms of afforestation coverage, for example. We have a conflict between provisioning and more environmental conservation perspectives. And there was a big issue where many people were concerned to maintain access, but at the same time, worried about potentially distractive behaviours of the public in these rural landscapes. Next slide, please. Farmers, if you look at the graph over here at the UK, it does seem that there's a shift in intention in decision making towards more intensification. This could be a response to the uncertainties following Brexit and needing to maintain an income, given the uncertainty with elms, for example, in England. However, I'm just going to point out it depends where you start from. So farmers might be moving from very extensive systems to more intense ones. We need information about what the sweet spot is in terms of ecosystem service delivery and progression to net zero when we're trading off between intensification and extensification. And I think Super-G is showing actually it's somewhere between the two extremes. Access to advice and technology, how to maintain ecosystem service delivery is important to farmers. And a question about how all of these might be incorporated into policy, for example, agri-environment schemes. Next slide, please. So farmers' values explain their decisions to intensify or extensify. Some farmers are very focused on food security. This tends to predict future management decisions, resulting in increased intensification and sometimes extensification of farming practices. So just looking at the qualitative work, there is an issue of quality and consumer demand for these more extensive systems. How does this relate to AE schemes in terms of payments? Some farmers prioritize stewardship and taking good care of the land farm to maintain current land management practice. The idea of good, apologies, there's a very yappy dog in the background. And a very noisy husband trying to quieten the dog down. My fault. Good livestock management is a priority for many farmers, but also people's lifestyles predicted changes. So as people change the stage in their farming career, for example, this might influence their willingness to make changes on the farm. Access to agri-environment schemes as income sources were also correlated to farmers' future PG management. And both the financial and non-financial impacts of policies and interventions on farmers need to be considered. This means that we need to consult with farmers, but we also need to consult with other people within society before policy-based interventions are enacted. So there has to be co-production of some of these policy-based interventions to make sure that they're acceptable to all of those affected by those policies. Next slide, please. Tipping points. So what is going to push a farmer to change their current practices? Farmers require financial incentives and technical guidance to trigger positive tipping points. And I saw a comment in the chat, which I think looks really relevant. So I'll come back to this at the end of the slide. Changes to agri-environment schemes and subsidy programs are needed to ensure more ecosystem service delivery from PG. Other decision drivers include personal values, perceived agronomic barriers, and consumer demand. How do we segment different groups of consumers in terms of what they want, in terms of these sustainable practices and the foods which they deliver? Land use and management change should be appropriate, context-specific, and align with farming values. And there also needs to be flexibility in, for example, payments, stacking of payments and incentives. And we need the right assessment metrics to make sure that we're not delivering against something where people make changes but we're measuring the outcomes, for example, whether a particular species re-inhabits that land. The test of this was against, in two case studies, land abandonment and stocking density. So we had good evidence that these factors are important in triggering change in relation to those two factors. And if I go back to the chat, the current funding policy is largely the result of Brexit and leaving CAP. It is. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty about where that's going. So the more information we can get from stakeholders about the acceptability of that policy, the better. Next slide, please. And we have a 5-minute break.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're just going to just to wrap up. So we've heard about the importance of permanent grasslands to deliver ecosystem services. And so just as a bit of a recap, what we mean by ecosystem services is the ability to deliver on production, biodiversity, carbon storage, regulation of greenhouse gases, clean water, and then also the landscape cultural values and the ability of permanent grasslands to protect soils from erosion and preventing flooding. So whilst in the UK, we've been relatively good at protecting our permanent grasslands, there has been a bit of a general decline since 1984, and a particular loss of these high biodiverse species-rich grasslands, which is sort of indicating a move to more intensification or abandoning of marginal grasslands. So in the talks, I hope we've just demonstrated the importance to develop agricultural policies to optimise the management of permanent grasslands. And just to recap, for policy, what we're seeing is a shift from direct payments to greening and to net zero objectives, and a more of a focus on payment for public delivery of public goods. With natural scientists, we're finding that what they want is to protect permanent grasslands and to prevent further decline. And the research that we've carried out has shown that multifunctional grasslands are increasingly important in agricultural systems, and also that there's a sweet spot in which we can optimise management intensity to deliver those ecosystem services. For citizens, they want permanent grasslands to deliver on those cultural services, and they would also like access to land. But also, as Lynn summarised, different people want different things, and there are differing perspectives on either prioritising either food production or biodiversity. And then finally, for farmers in the UK, our research has shown that they may be more likely than their EU counterparts to intensify future production, but really it does depend on where they're starting from. So it's a general and a mixed response, with some farmers moving PG management to more intensification and others to extensification. And, really just finding that from what we've heard is that there's a need to provide more information about what we mean by the sweet spot in terms of delivering ecosystem services and achieving net zero targets. So I guess now, if we just move on to the next slide, we really want to just hear from you and what you think of these contrasting really viewpoints, really, and get some feedback off you all. So you're all going to be assigned to a breakout group, and within that breakout group, I just want you to think about how can we develop policy which recognises these different views within society. And we've broken that down a bit more. So what policies are needed to support sustainable permanent grasslands? So for instance, are relegations and penalties working? Are there enough incentives provided? Is there enough information and voluntary compliance enough? And if not, if you don't agree with any of these, what should be changed really? Once you join the group, we will each assign one person within that group just to take notes and then report back afterwards about what was discussed, and we'll have about 20 minutes or so just to discuss what we've gone through. But in all, for this first breakout session, we'll have 30 minutes each, really, to go through those questions. Okay, so if there's not any questions at this point, I'll just check. Okay, shall we just go into those breakout groups now, and then we'll come back together to discuss later on.
So we're going for about half an hour, Kate, is that right?
Half an hour,
yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Kate, sorry to jump in.
Yeah, it's all right.
Okay, just one question really.
Yeah.
The different views within society, do we treat all views with equal weighting or equal importance?
Do you think then?
I think we have to take account of those different views. I think it's a difficult process to say actually the most frequently reported view is the one which we take into account the most. But I think certainly having research like this, which makes those views transparent, and then looking at ways to accommodate those different views in the policy process is great. A problem is that we're never going to get perfect consensus, so there has to be some trade-offs, for example, between access and not access as far as the public's concerned, for example. How we do that, we have to discuss. So sorry, that's not a very good answer, but I think it's the best I have.
Great. So we're going to be split up now, back at about 11:20, are we, I think?
Okay, maybe 5 minutes before the time is up, I will send a message to all the rooms so that you have a bit more planning on how to keep the time.
Great, thanks.
Great, thanks,
Joanna.
Okay.
Okay, so I think if we take a 5-minute break, if that's okay with everyone, if we just go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so we'll take 5 minutes, just grab a cup of coffee, get a drink, and then we'll come back and we'll just share points of view from the breakout groups. Okay, so we'll be back yeah, just before past, if that's all right.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah.
See you in a bit.
See you in a bit. Brilliant. So we just want the rapporteurs from each breakout session just to summarise some of the key points that we discussed, and so we can get a feeling if we've got different views or similar views across the different breakout groups. Joanna, okay to move to the next slide, please? Thanks. Perfect. Okay. Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay. So we slightly went off topic, I think, at times, but we did get drawn back. So our initial discussion was very much around what's the actual definition of permanent grassland, because we felt that it is widely varying and can sometimes be pretty intensive and other times much less so and semi-natural. And it's really important to get that definition right. Particularly because with the agri-environment schemes, managing grassland and getting the right outcomes for it is really highly dependent on what grassland you have. You could make it a lot worse or but improving it is tricky. And we talked about the constraints around the fact that grasslands always been there. It's been there for a long time, and its ecosystem goods, its biodiversity hasn't been particularly well recognised, and we think that's partly because it is very difficult to actually see huge differences or gains within those grasslands unless you're quite tightly defining the different types, individual types. Then what do we say? What is working well? We had a lot of discussions about what's not working well, actually. I think feel a lot of feelings that the new schemes are quite messy and a bit uncertain. that it's not very clear how you produce some of the goods that we want to be coming from grassland. There's not much advice, guidance. Yeah, it's farmers are having to engage with SFI because the basic farm payments are going, but it's really complex for them and unclear what to do. So some farmers may even think it's better just to disengage and do their own thing. And there's concern that for some upland areas, policies just looking at the large landscape schemes and not really thinking generally about how the uplands deliver food and ecosystem services, and that's a bit of a worry. Yeah, something I said is that there's a real concern around actually sustainability of farming itself. Farming landscapes rely on farmers, and if we're not encouraging farmers to sustain and do a good job with their grassland, then we'll get consolidation of larger farms, and ecosystem service delivery from those may be much less. Don't know about food delivery, but you know, we're really risking our farming industry if we don't support farmers to manage great grassland in the way that society wants it managed, and also to produce food fundamentally. We talked about a real lack of food policy. You know, why are we farming? What are we intending to achieve from it? What food do we actually want from our land? Are we trying to support ourselves as an island, or are we looking to other markets? To what extent do we look at other markets to bring food in and think about their ecology, the impacts on their environment as well? But yeah, there was a big, strong message that there isn't a very good food policy in the country. There isn't much thought about food security, safety, and things like decisions about public procurement, just not really thinking about. Also mentioned public access on grassland, which is something we hadn't really talked very much about. Issues with cattle, issues with affecting biodiversity, issues with dogs and sheep. Those kind of things are really important things to think about. Yeah, and consumers are part of this as well. So there's a whole raft of things that we need to be thinking about in terms of sustainable management, what's consumed, being able to afford high quality goods from well-managed sustainable grassland. And then there was a final comment about fertilizer, particularly about the fact that a lot of our research and work on grassland systems is based on a fertilizer-based system, and species that respond well to fertilizer, systems that respond well to fertilizer, and whether we need to be looking slightly differently at new systems that don't rely so heavily on fertilizer and new seeds, etc. I think that's it. Sorry, it was a bit rambling.
No, that was perfect. Thank you, Lisa. That's great. Thank you very much. I mean, before we move on, I think we've got one comment from Prisor on one of your points, Lisa. So I guess we can start the discussion now, really. The question is, there's some quite high-profile viewpoints that consolidation of farms equals more land free for management for goods other than food. So it's better for the environment, but the question is at what social cost? So yeah, it's a good point there.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that most of our land, well, it's not an argument, don't argue with Brissa, mainly agree with him. But I would say that, you know, we need the ecosystem services and goods and biodiversity from our farmland. It's what covers most of the country. And if we think of it as just a productive landscape without thinking of those goods, then that'll be a real problem for us in achieving any of sustainability targets.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I was just sort of reflecting what I've heard others say, really. I've heard some quite senior people in quite influential positions say, well, farmers will just have to go through what the miners went through, and we'll just have to leave them to go bust. And if we've got one super farm where we used to have 10 small farms, then that one landowner will be easier to deal with. We can, he or she will be able to spare a bit more land for afforestation or wildflowers or whatever it might be, and we'll be able to produce both food but also these other public goods. So the question I raised back was, the question that I put there as what social cost. But I think, that's there are quite senior people out there with those kind of viewpoints that we've got too many small, unviable farms, and we should just let a lot of them go, and then we can manage our land in a more efficient way, be that for food or for public goods or both.
Yeah, we did have a touch on the sort of sustainability of rural landscapes and towns and villages and farmers being sort of fundamental to that rural fabric, really. So yeah, tell me who these people are. I want to go and have a word with them. Anyway, I'll be quiet.
Too right, Lisa. Paul, should we go to your group and who's a raconteur for yours?
I think, Shani, did you say you were going to report back?
Yeah, I've taken notes, but everyone else feel free to chip in if I've missed something.
Thank you.
So for what sustainable permanent grassland really means, kind of said that, well, very different things to different people, but one thing that kept cropping up was the idea of multifunctionality. But also recognize that there's been a move in recent years towards a more targeted approach rather than trying to do fulfill all the requirements everywhere. More targeted for basically getting better results in certain areas for certain requirements. We talked about what sustainable grasslands would mean for Slovenia, where a lot of it is in the hill and mountain areas, and where last year they had problems with wildfires, and this year with severe erosion and the destruction of permanent grasslands. Well, it's just like a continuing cycle leading to more erosion, and that leads to more difficulty. And also the importance of permanent grasslands for tourism in Slovenia. Then I think we discussed about like the pitfalls of past policy regarding permanent grasslands and how not to repeat that now, and not just focus on what the priorities are currently in sustainability, but also what it's going to look like in the future. Then with talking about the regulations, think it was said that broadly speaking, the regulations are all right, but where they fall down is that there's no way to, police or enforce them really. And most of the regulations can be largely ignored or stretched to, because it's more of a voluntary approach of the farmers, at least in England, reporting to Natural England, and in Wales, it was noted that there was a lack of personnel to scrutinize applications that alter permanent grassland. There were some similarities noted between Slovenia and the UK, where there's a difference in subsidies paid out to upland and lowland farmers. And even though in the most recent SFI that's been changed to the same rate for upland and lowland, there still needs to be more work done on that regard. And with regard to Wales, with incentives, it was noted that it's tricky for a lot of farmers because the incentives don't really match up with what the market demands. And a lot of farmers are happy to, well, not happy, but it makes more sense for them to go along with like a 2-year market cycle rather than a long-term sustainability influence. And finally, we had like a very brief talk about a voluntary practice, and said that greater buy-in from retailers and more, sorry, I can't read my own handwriting. Yeah, that greater incentives from markets rather than just from the policy sphere would make this work better. I think I've definitely missed a lot, but everyone else can feel free to jump in.
That's great, thank you. I mean, a lot of the points that you raised there were particularly on regulation being ignored or stretched, and maybe greater incentives from markets was something that we picked up in our group. Liz, I wondered if you could summarise some of the key points from the final group. Is that all right?
Absolutely, and I will have the same issue with Ash, that my French language skills let me down, and I forgot that rapporteur was not just note-taking but also having to feedback. So I have taken notes, and we obviously had quite a broad-ranging discussion as well. But just some key points that was subtly different from some of the other discussions, which is always really interesting, is we had, as with everyone else, an initial discussion about how we define sustainably managed grasslands and then what well-managed looked like. We landed on well-managed, low-input grassland, and the recognition that not all PG grassland is currently in a good state. So obviously there's a need for improvement, which has to be done through better management of grazing and other land management interventions. We talked about policies and regulations, and we focused on, as most others did, about the negative impacts of certain policies and currently how they're implemented, the fact that they can actually be undermining in terms of their ability to protect and preserve the current asset, and that there's a favouring arable rotations. And there's a very good example given. If I've captured all the detail correctly, if I haven't, please do let me know. So GS4 for diverse lays, herbal lays, the payment rates for those are significantly higher than just maintaining permanent grassland as it stands. The EI regs are seen as something that can be got round as to necessarily having a value in terms of actually protecting the asset. So there's an issue of, if we're going to affect mindset change in the farming community, current policies need to reflect the value of the grasslands and not just focus on other objectives. Or if there are conflicting policy priorities, there has to be an understanding of it and those who are crafting the policies to try and minimize those impacts. We too looked at how things could be changed. And what was interesting is we discussed the fact that policies are not just public sector, but as has been raised by other groups, there's an opportunity here for private sector engagement with the farming community, water companies, for example, paying farmers, which we're already seeing, but also the idea of carbon sequestration on farm and there being carbon agreements. And so it's not necessarily something that government just needs to tackle themselves. There are lots of opportunities for collaboration across the sectors. And a good example of that was if we're looking at promoting trees on farm, but also maintaining grasslands, then agroforestry is something that could be considered. And there's examples discussed about a woodland trust initiative of paying for fencing and tree planting in lines, but then that also allows the opportunity for grazing in amongst those landscapes and taking hay crops as well. The aesthetic is something that we might have to discuss more carefully, but I think that reflects the fact that mindset change, as I've posted in the chat, is not just about the farming community. There's mindset change that needs to be taken place across the citizenry. And then I think a really, really strong point that was made by Liz at the end, not me, the other Liz on the call, about how mindset change has to come from within, and that effectively that needs to be driven by various elements. And it's about understanding what those drivers are for individual farmers and enabling that mindset shift to happen and to motivate that change. So as we discussed at the very beginning, no farmer is the same in side by side. So it's a very complex picture, but it doesn't mean, what did Liz say? That just because it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible. So that should be our overriding objective. I'm sure I missed, as Ash said, many things off there. So please, Ian, Liz, Kate, do come back and share anything that I've missed off that.
I think you had a very interesting point, Liz, when you were talking about the slides from the natural scientists, which showed a lot of the benefits that were being remunerated were in terms of yield and energy, and the ones that weren't were some of the things that more of the extensive farmers are trying to do, but they weren't getting paid for it. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but I thought that was a very fascinating point, Archer.
I think that linked back to specifically looking at, in the England context, of one of the mid-tier schemes, and the fact that we were talking about the areas where permanent grassland didn't win in those donut diagrams were in the ecosystem services that were currently sitting within a commodified market. So they were being valued, whereas the other ones were sat within what we would call public goods, and they're only valued from an income foregone perspective. And therefore that will never be of a significant economic return, in the sense that the other ones are an actual commodity, which inevitably will shift the economic focus. But if we can look at valuing those in a way that matches or is beyond, then that might help with that mindset change. But I think that reflected back on a comment that Liz and Ian were discussing, that it's not just about economics, and that there are other drivers for individual farmers. So I think that was that discussion, but please, everyone else, do come in if I've missed off anything crucial.
Great, thank you, Liz. Does anyone have any more comments around what we've discussed today, really? I mean, it's, you know, it sounds very broad. You know, there's a need to actually define what we mean by what we mean by sustainable PG, but also a whole suite of changes in terms of empowering and supporting farmers to make those changes with both policy and industry support, really. Is there any other comments on that?
Could I make a point about I was interested about the comments around low input grassland maybe being a primary objective from the natural science systematic review, other work. Low input's important, but we were also talking about the sort of sweet spot. So it's low to moderate intensity to sort of achieve multifunctionality. And I was also interested with Lisa's point about getting away from this sort of fertilizer dependent management to more where you're sort of relying on the carrying capacity of the land and introducing legumes and all the rest of it. And there seems to be a trend amongst some farmers. You know, they are going that way towards multi-species, towards encouraging clover, relying less on bagged purchase fertilizer, and economics is pushing farmers that way as well. But I was wondering, other than sort of agri-environment incentives, is there anything else that would give a further push in that direction, which would help in terms of making our grasslands sort of multifunctional while being also quite productive? So just, I mean, any other thoughts on that?
Well, Paul in my group, I don't know if he's still there, he was one to talk about it, because obviously he works with a seed manufacturer. But I think there has been such a, the whole route to production in grassland has been very much focused on very specific grassland swards, which are managed in particular ways. And I think that's made it really hard for farmers to understand how to manage differently with different swards that they've never grown before, how to get them in there in the first place, how to maintain them, how to graze them. And I think there's a real lack of information on that, and guidance and advice. And certainly groups of farmers I'm working with are saying, we're getting asked to do these things, we don't actually know how to do them effectively. And I think that's a real gap.
Great, no, thanks. So it's a push on the technical support side rather than further regulation, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. I think guidance and help to, I mean, yeah, they're going to other farmers often for that, and people like Liz. But yeah, I think there's a bit of a gap there.
I think too, we don't emphasize enough how essentially what government is pushing farmers towards with multi-species swards and lower input is organic grassland management. And I just think that the schemes aren't prescribing organic, but in many senses what they are pushing farmers towards is organic grassland management. And it's something that it's certainly a lot better defined than regenerative, which is more of a popular phrase at the moment. But I just think the category of organic grassland would tick a lot of these boxes with, no nitrogen, no herbicide use, the promotion of more plant diversity in it, and yet also still be productive. We're not, you're not strictly managing for, total species richness, but it's practical, productive grassland that just happens to be managed without nitrogen or herbicides. So.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Len, you had your hand up first. Would you like to?
It's just a general question. One issue is that certainly in the UK, and I think more generally, policies are disconnected from each other. So agricultural policy may be disconnected to food policy, if there is one, which might be disconnected to some of the environmental policies. I just wanted to ask the group if they thought that disconnect exists and whether it's a problem, and if it is, what to do about it.
Is anyone that disagrees with Len's comment there on the need to get to link up policy? No, Liz, you've got your hand up. Is that in response to Lynn's question?
Well, I appreciate this goes back to a phrase that the other Liz, said in our our discussion group, which is, I think integrated policy frameworks are fundamental to these changes, because we've seen through the historical policy frameworks we've had that they can undermine each other and then neither objective is achieved. So although it's very challenging to have integrated policy frameworks, they are fundamental to these mindset changes across the different sectors. And unfortunately, there will be inevitably some losers in that scenario, but I think there'll be far fewer losers than when you have siloed policy frameworks that don't recognize the opportunities and challenges of the other policies that are being developed, often in parallel.
Thank you, Liz. Liz, Jennifer, I don't know if you've had your hand up for a while. I don't know if you want to come in.
It was just to do with also thinking that we keep thinking about permanent grasslands in isolation to how it fits into the wider farming system. So some of the things we're debating, which is overstocking, use of fertilizer, could be dealt with tweaks elsewhere on the farm, but it's how we get an understanding of what other land types are available, what is their appropriate stocking rate, how are they planning breeding periods. I mean, all of that. So for me, it's how it fits at a system level, rather than if we just focus on permanent grassland, when we're missing all of the stuff that will influence it.
Anyone else to add on these points at all? I'll just mute myself.
Yeah, just coming in. So Ross Turner here, just to add a little bit to what Liz has just said, and which I totally sort of agree with. But also we need to recognise that actually what is occurring on a large amount of permanent grassland at the moment isn't wrong and isn't bad. We're assuming at the moment that everything is, or there's a tendency to assume that everything that's occurring on British farms at the moment is bad.
and it's not. And we need to be able to recognise the good that is occurring on British grassland farms by farmers at the moment, and that actually we don't need to be going in with new multi-species lays in some scenarios, because actually they already exist. And the danger with any policy is that we have to have change in order to measure and monitor. And in some cases, actually just recognising the good that's going on is equally as important.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Ross. And I think it ties in nicely with Lizzie's previous comment about conservationists recognising, the green desert sort of point of view, really. It seems like a bit of a PR campaign, and education on what PG's provided is really needed. As we're coming close to sort of wrapping up, I just wondered if there's any other final sort of burning points that people would like to make. Are there any key messages that we haven't quite covered that we should be capturing? No, we're all happy with that. That's great. Okay, perfect. Oh, we've got a comment from Paul. He's popped it in the chat. Paul, do you want to just responded to Liz's point? We did some work on PGs for different farming systems using the FADN data. We do need to work on the farm level, but recognising that every farm is different. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think that pretty much says it. Yeah. Yeah, it definitely needs more work, and something that we will try and distill. So in the last few months of the project, sort of have some more thoughts on that. We do have this farming system classification in terms of how PG fits into different farming systems, a proportion of PG on farm, different livestock types, the value of PG in terms of its contribution to the overall farm business. But it's trying to come up with a classification while also recognising that virtually every farm is different.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Great. I wonder if we just move to the last slide then, please, Joanna. Perfect. Okay. Well, just really to say thank you to everyone today for taking the time to take part in the discussion, and we really appreciated you joining us today. And we've got a huge amount of information and viewpoints from the discussion. So thank you very much. So the next steps, really, what are we going to do with all this information? So we're basically going to collect everything that we've gathered today, and then it's going to be used to inform a policy briefs that we're going to produce for the UK and the European Commission. And please do let us know if you'd like a copy of these policy briefs. That they will be publicly available for you to access, and we can send them to you. But equally, if you want to hear more about the project Outpoint, you're all very welcome to join us. We've got a final stakeholder conference which is taking place. It's a hybrid event. So you can join online, and it's taking place in Brussels, but online, and it's on Wednesday, the 7th of February. So you did hear more about some of the final outputs from the project, and a bit more on the policy briefs that we're referring to today. So are there any final comments from Paul or Lynn or even Eric? If not,
well, just say thank you to everybody. It's been fabulous that you've helped us with this. We've got some brilliant information that we can work with. So thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been really, really useful today. So we'll do our best to capture everything that was said and incorporate it into the policy briefs.
Perfect, great. And we'll get a copy across to you, Priscilla, definitely. Brilliant. Okay, we'll wrap up there. Thanks a lot, everyone. And
thanks, everyone.
Soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.